Good afternoon. This is the St. Peter's presentation of
Unsettling Truths
Unsettling Truths.
with Mark Charles.
And we are so excited to be here today. So get ready for a wonderful presentation. And you can listen to this at a further date if, because it's being recorded. Thanks so much and enjoy.
So it is being recorded?
Mhm.
Okay.
Right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's happening through this, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Good. All right.
So
So maybe let folks know that
wait a
there's.
little bit longer? Or
Yeah. Maybe I'll just. So I just want to welcome everybody informally first. Jim's going to welcome you in just a minute and just let you know there's a little hospitality back there. Not a lot, but the best that there could be is ice water, right? So that the jug is full of ice water that's fresh, and there's lemonade, and that's what we got. So enjoy it. Oh, and the other thing to say is that there's a bathroom right through that hallway.
Yeah. So thank you for coming out on such a warm night and such short notice. Here, Mark Charles. I just learned about Mark maybe 2 months ago from a common friend, Ron Span, a pastor in the city, and watched a video and was very taken with Mark's challenging presentation about the history of this country and the Doctrine of Discovery in particular. And so when we learned he was going to be in town on a book tour just last week, we scrambled, and here we are, very thankful for a bit of turnout this evening, and just had a little bit of dinner with Mark and Sienna, his daughter, and Ron and Jackie Span, and my own wife here. Very rich conversation. I think we're in for a treat and a deep challenge. So without more ado, Mark Charles.
Hey.
Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Well, yate, Mark Charles, yeah. Sin beked na nishla, do toy hubini bachis chi. Sin beked na dashi tater to the cheatney dashinala. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineal as a people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. So my mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Sin beked na nishla. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Toa Higlini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Sin Beked Dana. And my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totichiti, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. Before we begin, I just want to remind everyone that in this church, masks are required. So if you don't have a mask, we have some in the back by the book table where my daughter is selling books. But this is a requirement of the church. And this, of course, we all want to be careful with COVID right now on its uptick. And so I'll be putting my mask back on right after I'm done speaking. But before I begin, I want to just give a land acknowledgement. And I want to acknowledge that here in Detroit, we are on the land of the Fox, the Peoria, the Anishinaabe, the Potawatomi, the Maiamia, and the Mississauga. These are the nations that were here long before Columbus got lost at sea. These were the nations who have been living in these lands and stewarding these lands. They were raising their families here and burying their dead here. These are the families that were the nations that were removed from these lands so that cities like Detroit could be built up. I want to honor the indigenous peoples of these lands. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just acknowledge what a humbling experience it is to be on these incredibly beautiful and just incredible land that we're on today. So Shahat, all of my relatives who are indigenous to these lands here. Over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a presentation, and the title of this presentation is Warning, Unsettling Truths Will Challenge Your Paradigm. Unsettling Truths is the title of the book that I co-authored. My co-author is a professor from Fuller Seminary. He used to be at North Park Seminary in Chicago. His name is Seung-Chan Rah. He's written many other books before. One of his most well-known books is The Next Evangelicalism. He also wrote this book called A Prophetic Lament, which is a very powerful book about not only the role of lament, the discipline of lament in the church, but how Western Christianity in general and American Christianity specifically is anemic at the discipline and the process of lament. Seung-Chan Rah and I have been friends for over a decade. And we decided about 6 or 7 years ago to write this book together. And when we signed the contract with InterVarsity Press, we had a few offers from a few publishers. We decided to go with InterVarsity Press because we thought they would edit us the least. When we signed the contract, we had a very ambitious writing schedule of a year. And after a year, we hadn't even started yet. And we signed the contract in 2015. And initially, the book was going to be about the Doctrine of Discovery, and it was going to be a call for the church to lament. Well, a year later, we sat down and we had just elected Donald Trump as our president, largely in part of the role of white evangelicals. And we sat down and discussed the content of our book and our trajectory of our thesis. And we decided to change the trajectory of a book. Instead of a call to simply lament, the book was going to become an open rebuke of the church. And not just the right-leaning conservative church, but the entire church, the American church, Western Christianity for 1,400 years. And so I often tell people that even if you're not of the Christian faith tradition, we wrote Unsettling Truths for you. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian or a Hindu or an atheist or follow one of our indigenous religions. Doesn't matter if you came over here on the Mayflower, your family, or if you jumped the fence last week. The book was written to address all people living on Turtle Island. And it was written specifically to address how, as Americans, no matter what our faith tradition is, we have a dependence upon a heretical Christian doctrine known as the Doctrine of Discovery. If you go online and read about Unsettling Truths, you will see a lot of people commenting, and one of the phrases they will use when they talk about Unsettling Truths is that it will challenge or even change your paradigm. And that was very much the goal of the book. We wanted to really shift the way people saw ourselves as a nation, saw the church, and understood our history. And if you look at the definition of what a paradigm is, we have a general use of the paradigm, which is people talk about having a personal paradigm, a personal model or structure, or a way that they see and understand things in the world around them. And they will talk about their paradigm being challenged. But if you look at paradigm academically, paradigm is actually a set of structures or models or rules about a certain discipline. And if you want to excel in that discipline, you have to work within that structure, within that model, and it kind of dictates the way that you go. And so in this, one just example someone gave me the other day is for a long time, we had the paradigm that the earth was the center of the universe. And through that paradigm, we had to explain all of the strange movements of the stars and the way that we saw them. And our perspective was that they were going around the earth. And then when the paradigm shifted, and now we understood that the sun was the center of the solar system, we were all going around the sun, that changed our paradigm. And then when we got even further out into space and realized that, no, actually, yes, we have solar systems, but we have hundreds of solar systems and thousands of galaxies and all of these places all around, and they're actually moving kind of chaotically. And that, again, shifted the paradigm. So we talk about we have a personal paradigm, but usually we're talking about there is a paradigm, a more communal, a more truthful paradigm. And the goal of Unsettling Truths is to shift that paradigm. So I decided for the theme of my book tour, the one I'm on right now, that I would title it Challenging Your Paradigm, because what I want to do is I want to shift enough personal paradigms so that we get a critical mass so that the national paradigm actually begins to shift as well, the whole paradigm. And I'm talking about the paradigm of how we see history, of how we understand the church, and of how we understand what it means to be an American. So before I can go a whole lot further, I want to just, for those of you who don't know about the Doctrine of Discovery, who's heard of the Doctrine of Discovery before? Okay, a few of you, some of you haven't. The Doctrine of Discovery, it's a series of papal bulls, edicts of the Catholic Church. It says things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to their use and profit. The Doctrine of Discovery is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours for the taking. So this is the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people because they did not see them as human. It's the same doctrine that allows Columbus, who was literally lost at sea, to land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and claim to have discovered it. The first sentence of the first chapter of the book says you cannot discover land already inhabited. If you don't believe me, leave your cell phones, your laptops, your car keys out. My daughter and I will come by and discover them for you. Right? This is not discovery. You can colonize those lands, you can steal those lands, you can conquer those lands. You cannot discover them unless you dehumanize the people who are already living there. So one of the first paradigms, I'm going to go through a few paradigms tonight and just talk about some of the ways the book begins to shift those things. So one of the first paradigms I want to discuss is this paradigm of you cannot discover lands already inhabited. Now, our nation is beginning to have that paradigm challenged. It's not shifting yet, but it's being challenged. For example, we used to all, when we grew up, younger kids back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we all celebrated Columbus Day, right? We were told in our history books that Columbus was the one who discovered America. In the past decade, primarily, that paradigm has been challenged. And Native peoples, much like myself, have said, why are we celebrating someone who didn't discover lands but was actually just lost at sea? And why don't we instead celebrate the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island? And so many communities, many cities, many states around the country are beginning to shift their paradigm, and instead of celebrating Columbus Day, they're now celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day. That's a slight shift in the paradigm. But the challenge we face as a nation is not just that we celebrate Columbus Day. It's that we have a paradigm, a legal paradigm, that says Native peoples are not fully human. So in 1763, King George drew a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he said to the colonists that were here that they no longer had the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset the colonies. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. They went on to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savagery. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines before the statement all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason the founding fathers used that inclusive term all men, because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. In 1823, we had a Supreme Court case. It was Johnson versus McIntosh. Two men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe. The other one got the same land from the government, and they want to know who owned it. Case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The court had to decide the principle upon which land titles were based. They ruled the principle was that discovery gave title to the land, but to the government by whose subjects it was made. And then they went on to reference the Doctrine of Discovery and argue that even though natives were here first, but because we are savages, we only have the right of occupancy to the land. And the Europeans have the right of discovery to the land, the free title to it, so therefore they are the true title holders. That case written, that opinion written by John Marshall in 1823, began to establish the legal precedent for land titles. That precedent and the Doctrine of Discovery are referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. I have a TEDx talk online. It's called We the People, the Three Most Misunderstood Words in US History. And it talks about, it goes through the final 2005 court case. I won't go through the whole case for you right now. But in the first footnote of the case, where they're arguing precedent, they reference in 2005 the Doctrine of Discovery. In 1823, when John Marshall is writing his opinion of the doctrine of the legal precedent for land titles, let me give you his argument. I'll read it for you here. He wrote, "But the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages, whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their own lands was to leave the country a wilderness." That was the argument in 1823. In 2005, the Supreme Court argued, "Moreover, the properties here involved have greatly increased in value since the Oneidas sold them 200 years ago. It was not until lately that the Oneidas sought to regain ancient sovereignty over land converted from wilderness to become parts of city like Sherrill." In 2005, they're using the exact same opinion and reasoning that they used in 1823. They just didn't use the word savages. Now, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, if you had to guess who on the Supreme Court in 2005 might have written such an opinion, what would your guess be? Let's try Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Right? She wrote the opinion. One of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. How is that possible? Isn't her legacy that she was an advocate for the marginalized people, a voice of dissent in an increasingly conservative Supreme Court, fighting for the rights of those on the margins? She was, in many respects, up until it got to the issue of land titles. You see, when your land title is based on the legal understanding that natives are savages, suddenly white supremacy becomes a bipartisan value. This is the paradigm we have to shift. Yes, it's good that we're no longer celebrating Columbus Day, but let's talk about our legal precedent for land titles. This is the issue no one wants to talk about. This is the paradigm no one wants to shift. Several years ago, I was speaking at a conference in Atlanta, Georgia, and as a part of this conference, it was on the Doctrine of Discovery. It was located in an inner city church, urban church. Mostly people of color were in attendance. And I was the last speaker. I was the last speaker of the conference. And they asked all of us after we spoke to leave a few deep questioning thoughts for the audience. So the afternoon before I spoke, they took us on a tour of their neighborhood. Their neighborhood was not dissimilar to many neighborhoods here in Detroit: blighted, abandoned buildings, burned down buildings. So they took us to a school that had burned down. And they said, because the school burned down, the kids are now being bussed out of the city, or out of their neighborhood, and being educated all around the city. So they asked us to pray that more kids, they could rebuild the school so that more kids could be educated in their neighborhood. They also brought us to a community center where they were raising up leaders local to that neighborhood. And so they asked us to pray that they could raise up more leaders locally to lead that community. Finally, they brought us to an abandoned house. Half the houses in the neighborhood were abandoned. The other half were all rental units. And they asked us to pray that the renters in that neighborhood could become homeowners. Because that's how you do community development, right? If you don't want to gentrify the neighborhood, you find ways to convert renters into homeowners of the houses they're now renting. So they took us on the tour, brought us back, and then I gave my talk on the Doctrine of Discovery, and I laid out the things I just told you about land titles. And at the end of my session, part of my deep questions for the audience is that I said, so I'm curious, because this afternoon we visited this house, and you asked us to pray that more people in this neighborhood could buy their houses. I'm curious how you feel now that I've informed you that land titles are based on the legal understanding that natives are not human. How does this make you feel? And the people, again, most of them people of color, said, well, we don't have access to good lending, we don't have access to good jobs, this is hard for us. I said, no, that's not the question. Remember, we asked for divine intervention here. We asked for God's help to convert these renters into landowners. I'm just asking how you feel about the fact that what you're aspiring to is based on the perpetuation of Native peoples being seen as savages. And the people just looked at me. And I said, this is the problem. We don't know what justice looks like when everything we have is stolen. That's the paradigm we need to show. What does justice look like when everything you have is stolen? Who's seen Mount Rushmore? Right. Beautiful Black Hills in South Dakota. Decades ago, the US stole those hills from the Lakota people. Took them. Then they carved the faces of some of their most genocidal presidents into those hills. Later, they felt guilty about it. And so they went to the Lakota people and they said, hey, we feel bad about this. We'd like to buy these mountains from you. Pay you for them. Reparation. The Lakota people said they're not for sale. Even that, but they're not for sale. There's literally $1 billion sitting in the trust fund today. The Lakota people refuse to touch because their sacred mountains aren't for sale. The country doesn't know what to do with that, right? That is so outside of their paradigm of exploitation and profit, of civilizing savages and their lands. They don't know what to do with that, so that money's just sitting there. This is one of the paradigms this book is going to challenge you to shift. There's another paradigm I want to talk about. This is the paradigm of the generally accepted truth that the victors write the history, right? We all have heard that phrase before. Generally, this is the truth. It's the victors write the history. One of the biggest challenges, well, so just to prove my point, and I'll just tell you up front, if you buy the book, two of the hardest chapters to read will be chapters 9 and 10. Chapters 9 and 10 look at this paradigm of the victors write the history. And we start the chapter by telling the story of two men about the same age, both of whom are now dead. They were both born in the late 20s or early 30s. Their names were Oscar Groening and Robert McNamara. Oscar Groening was born in Germany. He grew up in Germany and he served in the Nazi military. And he was stationed at one of the concentration camps, one of the death camps that was held by the Nazis, where they were gassing the Jewish people. And he was working there as an accountant. He wasn't gassing people, he wasn't guarding people, he wasn't shooting people, he was merely counting the possessions that the Nazis stole from them and then giving them the counting up higher up the chain. And he was uncomfortable with what was going on at, I think he was at Auschwitz. And he asked for a transfer and it didn't come for a very long time, but he was very uncomfortable being there. He finally got the transfer and he was moved into the front lines. He was captured and he was sitting in a prison camp when the war ended. So he went home and lived a very quiet life until the mid-90s, when the Holocaust denier movement began to rise. And he was outraged at the people who were denying the Holocaust. And so he went public about the things he saw while serving at this concentration camp. And he gave interviews contradicting what the deniers were saying. And he gave one very public interview, I think it was on the BBC, where he talked about what he saw at this camp. And after the interview, he was arrested and tried for his complicity in the murder of 300,000 Jewish people because he served in this camp. He was found guilty. In his trial, he acknowledged he was absolutely guilty, or he was absolutely complicit. He questioned if he was morally or legally guilty for the actual deaths, but he absolutely agreed he was complicit. And he was appealing his case when he died, and he died a condemned war criminal. Robert Mcnamara was born about the same time, 6 years apart. He grew up in California, and he served in the Pacific Rim during World War II, under General LeMay of the Air Force. And he worked as an analyst. And he was analyzing the bombing raids that LeMay was doing over Japan and other areas of the world. And he was analyzing the bombs, and he was noticing that we were not hitting our targets well because we were flying our planes way too high above the jet stream, and we didn't understand the jet stream well back then, and so they were being blown off course and missing their targets. So he recommended we fly our planes lower. General LeMay was planning a raid in Japan, not Nagasaki, not Hiroshima. He was planning what's called Operation Meeting House, which is actually the deadliest bombing in all of the history of the world. Nagasaki and Hiroshima killed 40,000 and 60,000 respectively. Operation Meeting House, the incendiary bombing of Tokyo, killed 100,000. And he flew the planes lower over Tokyo, and they burned the city. We chose Tokyo because we knew it was a wind city, it would burn hotter. And we just destroyed it, killed 100,000 civilians in a single night. After he finished his service in the war, Robert Mcnamara was given the Legion of Merit, one of the higher honors in our military. He was actually working for the Ford Motor Company. I was just informed yesterday. I already knew this, but I was reminded he worked for the Ford Motor Company here in Detroit when he was tapped to serve as the Secretary of Defense. In the 60s, he served as the Secretary of Defense. He was one of the architects of the Vietnam War, including the use of Agent Orange. After he was finished with that service, he was given the Medal of Freedom. And he died and was buried with honors at Arlington. In the final years of his life, Robert Mcnamara was in a documentary called The Fog of War. And in his documentary, he was wrestling with what he had done over the history of his life. And in one quote, one interview in the documentary, this is what he said. He said, the human race prior to that time and today has not really grappled with the rules of war. Was there a rule that said you shouldn't burn to death 100,000 civilians in a night? LeMay said, if we lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. And I think he's right. He, and I'd say I, were behaving as war criminals. So what's the difference between Oscar Groening and Robert Mcnamara? One who served in Auschwitz and was found guilty of complicity in the death of 300,000 people and died a condemned war criminal, and the other who served in the US Army, served in the Pacific Rim under General LeMay, and admitted he was guilty of the death of war crimes and the death of, and we killed 300,000 civilians in the bombing raids in Japan. One died a convicted war criminal, the other died with honors and awards. What's the difference between the two men? It's not right or wrong, it's not good or bad. It's winners and losers, right? Nazi Germany lost the war, so their soldiers, when caught and found, died condemned war criminals. We won the war, and even though we did some of the exact same things, our soldiers and our military men and women died war heroes. The only difference between Oscar Groening and Robert McNamara is whose side won the war. But the book isn't about Oscar Groening and Robert McNamara. The book, or those two chapters, are about the greatest president in the history of the United States of America, not only by public consensus, but also by political consensus. You know who I'm talking about? Abraham Lincoln. Don't you imagine for a moment, okay, just imagine Nazi Germany wins World War II. How would their historians have recorded the legacy of Adolf Hitler? Well, he would be an absolute war hero, right? Brought them from global disgrace to global prominence. He'd be their greatest leader ever. How would their historians record the Holocaust? Well, we had Holocaust deniers today. They lost the war. Imagine if they won. What Holocaust? There was no Holocaust. See, one of the challenges we face as a country is the United States of America has never lost a war that matters. Never. We've never been invaded. We've never given up large tracts of land. We've never had a regime change. We've never been disarmed. We've never borne the scorn of the global community. We've never lost a war that matters. As a result, we've written our own history for 250 years. And if you think the difference between Oscar Groening and Robert McNamara was striking, wait until you understand the difference between Adolf Hitler and Abraham Lincoln. We did the exact same thing to Abraham Lincoln that Nazi Germany would have done to Adolf Hitler. When you read his rhetoric and you look at his policies and you see the things that he did and the things he stood for and the things he stated and the things he signed, Adolf Hitler was not only one of the most white supremacists, blatant white supremacists, unapologetic white supremacists in our nation's history, but he was also one of the most genocidal presidents we've ever had. Chapters 9 and 10, I can almost promise you will throw your book at the wall at least once, because it completely deconstructs the mythological legacy of Abraham Lincoln. As we're trying to shift your paradigm. Why do you think our nation is so absolutely over the top terrified of critical race theory? Why? Our historians, our government, our leaders have been building an incredibly complex and intricate, but very, very, very delicate house of cards for 250 years. And they are terrified to allow the voices of the marginalized to even breathe in the general direction of their house of cards. Because they know that thing is going to topple over. And so they are terrified about history being spoken from the perspective of marginalized peoples. They're terrified about the things that they have been blaming on individuals as being identified instead as systemic. This is why our nation is up in arms about critical race theory right now. Because our history, did you know just last week, the Texas Board of Education had to turn down a proposal to refer to the movement of Africans to the United States as from being kidnapped in Africa and brought here to enslave. They had to turn down a proposal that suggested they teach their school children that they were, what's the exact word they used? They called them, unintentionally relocated or something like that.
Oh, my gosh.
Our history is a house of cards. And it's because we've never lost a war that matters. For 250 years, we've written our own history. And no one's had the power to challenge us. And you see it most clearly in the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln. One last paradigm I want to begin to challenge and shift for you is the notion of trauma. In chapter 11, we begin to look at the understanding of trauma, and we talked about post-traumatic stress, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's an individual diagnosis that usually results from a single horrifying event, and it causes a traumatic response in the victim of that event. If that victim experiences a continuation of that traumatic experience, they can get what's called a complex PTSD. Complex PTSD doesn't come from a single event, it comes from a series of events. So if you get PTSD from being in a battle or from being assaulted, you get complex PTSD from living in a war zone or living in an abusive relationship. Psychologists have observed that a complex PTSD can manifest itself in the children and grandchildren of those who are impacted. They don't quite know how it happens, but they observe it in the children and grandchildren. There's another trauma called HTR, which is historical trauma. This is about how psychologists understand the dissatisfaction in a broad community. I refer to historical trauma as a multi-generational communal manifestation of a complex PTSD. Historical trauma was first observed in Native communities after a history of boarding schools and Indian removal. You can also see in African American communities after a history of enslavement and Jim Crow laws and segregation, mass incarceration. You can see it in Japanese American communities after the history of internment camps. You can see it in Jewish communities after their history of the Holocaust. It's a multi-generational communal manifestation of a complex PTSD. As I've been speaking about the doctrine of discovery in this history for 15 years now, I began to observe a traumatic response, not in my communities of color only, but also in white people. And I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't have a paradigm of what to do with the trauma I was observing in white people. The only paradigm I really offered as a nation is the paradigm of white people are racist, which isn't helpful because if you're racist just because you lack pigmentation in your skin, it means every time you disagree with me, I have to treat you as an opposition or an enemy, not either confront you or defend myself. It's not helpful to conversation. The other paradigm we have for white people is that you're fragile, right? After the lynching of George Floyd a few years ago, the book by Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility, went through the roof. Everyone started buying it because we have this paradigm of white people are fragile. There's a lot of good insight in that book, but the paradigm of fragility is troubling because it means I either have to walk on eggshells around white people or I have to smooth everything over, which isn't helpful. So I propose, based on some research that I found by Rachel Mcnamara, who wrote a book called Perpetration-Induced Traumatic Stress. She calls it the psychology of killing. So she researched if your society gives you a license to take a life, a license to kill. You're in military service, you're law enforcement, you are a drone pilot, you have some position in the society that gives you, in certain circumstances, the right to take a life. What does that do to you psychologically? And her research led her to conclude that it causes a perpetration-induced traumatic stress, which she said is like PTSD in almost every way, shape, and form, except that PTSD afflicts the victim of the horrifying event and PITS afflicts the perpetrators. So I used her research and I mixed that with my observations, and I hypothesized that if PTSD has a multi-generational communal manifestation that afflicts communities of color, what if PITS also had a multi-generational communal manifestation at a complex level, which results in a traumatic response in white people? And so I interact with white Americans as another group of traumatized people. Now, I'm very clear, you're not victims of trauma. This is based on what has been enacted for you, maybe even by you, or at least on your behalf. And this is what results, this is what you're standing on. You're not victims of this trauma, you're perpetrators of it. And so I begin to shift that paradigm for you in chapter 11 and give you a new lens to look at the response of white America to the things going on in society, whether it's critical race theory, whether it's the lynching of Black people by law enforcement officers, whether I'm observing how white America responds to these things, and I think I'm proposing that they're responding out of the traumatic response. And so chapter 11 will begin to shift that paradigm for you and hopefully give you a tool that not only will help you better understand what's going on in our country, but even for, and that chapter is directed to people of color. I'm not trying to convince white people that you're traumatized. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to convince people of color that white people are traumatized so we can interact with white people in a more helpful way. So we can actually stop them, you, from disrupting the work we're trying to do. When we continue to center you, when we treat you as fragile, when we just conclude because you lack pigmentation in your skin that you're racist, that allows your disruptive behavior to continue to disrupt what we're trying to do. One of the most effective tools I've found to soften that is to understand and to treat white Americans as another group of traumatized people. So that's the paradigm I'm going to try and shift for you in chapter 11. Comes out of both my own experience of being the driver of a car in which my brother was killed, a perpetration-induced traumatic stress that I experienced and took years of me to work through, and then how that experience shaped my thinking about what I was observing in white America for what you are standing on. The reason I'm doing this, not just me, my co-author and I, the reason we're doing this is because we want to give you a new lens through which you can see the world. The purpose of the book. I don't want to just change your paradigm, I want to change the paradigm. And I want to give you two examples of some things I hope you'll be able to see differently after you read this book. So this isn't coming from the book, this is, if you allow your paradigm to be challenged through the book, you will probably begin to see things like I'm going to point out for you in just a few minutes. So one of those things I want you to, that you'll probably begin to see differently is right now we're going through a trial publicly about, our hearings at least, publicly about white Christian nationalism, right? It's in our media, it's in the news, we're seeing it, it's happening in front of us. And all of us have seared in our brains, right, this picture of this park in front of the White House, Lafayette Park, and there was protests going on where people were protesting violence against people of color by law enforcement officers. And then one afternoon, that and this was what date was that? This was June 1st of 2020. That park is aggressively cleared of protesters. And Donald Trump walks out, walks across the park, stands in front of St. John's Cathedral, pulls up his Bible, upside down initially, and then turns it around. Takes a picture, and then walks back. Right? That's seared in our brains, all of us, right? We've seen that image dozens of times. And he was called out for what he was doing. He was giving a dog whistle to white Christian nationalists, right? That was very clear. And that was what he was doing, and he got called out rightfully for that. Eventually, we got to January 6th, and we got to the insurrection that happened there, the white nationalist terrorist attack, and now we have the trials going on. And today we are absolutely blaming white Christian nationalism on white Republican conservative Christians. We're laying all of it at their feet. And I don't deny that that group is manifesting a very explicit understanding of white Christian nationalism. But the things that we miss is that most of the challenges we face as a nation, we face not because of one party or the other, we face because of our foundation. Right? The Declaration of Independence, we first named it as savages. The Constitution never mentions women, counts Africans as 3/5 of a person, specifically excludes natives. Slavery was never abolished. The 13th Amendment really redefines and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system, right? Our nation doesn't struggle with racism, sexism, white supremacy in spite of our foundations. We struggle with it because of our foundations. These are our national values. And the same is true with white Christian nationalism. And to prove that, in August of 2021, there was a terrorist attack in Afghanistan. US military, there was a bombing of an Air Force base, or of an airport there. And lives of US service members were lost in that bombing. And the day after that bombing, or a few days after that bombing, Joe Biden gave a speech. And in his speech, this is what he said. I'm going to read part of the speech for you. He said, "To those who carried out this attack, as well as anyone who wishes America harm, know this. We will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay. I will defend our interests and our people with every measure of my command." He went on to say, "I want to thank the Secretary of the Defense and the military leadership at the Pentagon and all the commanders in the field. There have been complete unanimity from every commander on the objectives of the mission and the best way to achieve those objectives." He's just thanking people for helping. And then he said, well, let me rephrase that. In his State of the Union, Joe Biden used the word sacred twice. He used the word sacred once in reference to the Capitol. He said, "This is a sacred space." He used it another time when he talked about our obligation to our military veterans. He was pointing out how horrible our care for our veterans is. And he said, we have a sacred obligation to treat our veterans better. And I do not disagree that we have a very high moral obligation to care for our veterans and help them deal with the horrors of war that they experience while they serve our country. I do not deny that for a moment, but he called it a sacred obligation. Why would he bring in the aspect of the divine to how we treat our military service members? Well, he explained that in his speech in August of 2021. He said, "Those who have served throughout the ages have drawn inspiration from the book of Isaiah when the Lord says, 'Whom shall I send and who shall go for me?' And the American military has been answering for a long time, 'Here am I, Lord, send me. Here I am, send me.'" So according to Joe Biden, the US military is a prophetic arm of the Lord responding to a prophetic call on par with that of Isaiah the prophet. And he, as our president, is the commander-in-chief of that army. Right? Donald Trump says things because he wants attention, he wants people to love him. He doesn't know what he's saying half the time. Joe Biden is a bit more shrewd. They're both incredibly dangerous white Christian nationalists. One out of their ignorance and the other out of their shrewdness. Why do both the left and the right use the rhetoric of white Christian nationalism? Because the United States of America truly believes in its heart that we are God's chosen people, that we are a Christian nation, and that Turtle Island is our promised land. That's one thing I expect to begin to see differently. You'll see things like that after you read this book. Next, I want to talk about treaties. This is a big issue within Indian country. I saw it displayed at the Smithsonian Museum of American Indian that said there were more than 400 treaties signed between Native nations and the US government, and every single one of them has been broken. Section 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution states that treaties are the supreme law of the land. In 2020, there was a Supreme Court case, McGirt versus the state of Oklahoma. Under Indian law, when a Native American commits a crime on a reservation against another Native American, the jurisdiction for that crime falls under the federal government. So we are tried in federal court instead of in state court. McGirt was convicted of committing a horrific crime against a Native woman in the city of Tulsa, and he was found guilty in the state court in Oklahoma. And he appealed that decision, not because he said he was innocent, but he said, you tried me in the wrong court. Under treaty, Tulsa is on a reservation, and I should have been tried in a federal court. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and Neil Gorsuch, who is actually one of the justices on the Supreme Court who understand Indian law the best, he served in Colorado for a number of years and dealt with many cases with Indian law. He wrote the opinion in 2020. And it was greeted with great enthusiasm because he actually sided with McGirt. Oklahoma argued and said, we've never treated Tulsa and eastern Oklahoma as reservation land. The courts have since agreed with us it's not reservation land. Therefore, we had the right to try him in state court. And Neil Gorsuch, in his opinion in 2020, wrote that the state doesn't have the right to break the treaty, and the courts don't have the right to break the treaty. And therefore, that treaty is still standing for judicial purposes at least, and he should have been tried in a federal court. Now, this was greeted with great enthusiasm around most of the Indian country. I was at the time, this is summer of 2020, I was at the time running for president of the United States as an independent candidate. And because of the research I've done, I don't trust the Supreme Court at all. And so I read the entire opinion. And true to form, it said exactly what you would expect it would say about Native peoples. The agreement actually goes on, or the opinion goes on, and it says, to determine whether a tribe continues to hold a reservation, there is only one place we may look, the acts of Congress. This court long ago held that the legislature wields significant constitutional authority when it comes to tribal relations, possessing even the authority to breach its own promises and treaties. Later it said only Congress can divest the reservation of its land and diminish its boundaries. So no matter how many other promises to a tribe the federal government has already made, has already broken, if Congress wishes to break the promise of a reservation, it must say so. History shows that Congress knows how to withdraw a reservation when it can muster the will. So he's very clear. The state can't do this, the courts can't do it, but anytime Congress wants to do it, all it has to do is say the word. And it can break a treaty in an instant. Even though the Constitution says treaties are the supreme law of the land. In 2007, there was a declaration made by the United Nations. It was called UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It was a declaration that advocated that indigenous peoples have rights to education, to sovereignty, to voices about their land. They have rights. We have rights. And it was passed by almost every nation in the country, in the world, except for Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. Now, why did those 4 countries not adopt this declaration? Well, because most of the world was colonized by Europe. But over the past century or so, Europe has withdrawn. They pulled out of India, they pulled out of other parts of the world, and they've gone back to mostly to their own countries. There's a few countries where the colonizers stayed, and some of those countries are New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United States, where the colonizers still live alongside the indigenous peoples. And so those 4 nations were terrified to acknowledge that indigenous peoples have rights. So we didn't sign the declaration. In 2008, we had a regime change in our country. We elected our first Black president, and we thought many things are going to change. And in 2011, it was stated by the Obama administration that we were now going to adhere to UNDRIP. We're going to sign on to this. This was met with great fanfare. There was a lot of celebrating. But if you read the statement issued by the State Department when we made this agreement, you will find that we actually were very specific about what we were agreeing to. We stated in our statement by the State Department that we saw UNDRIP as not legally binding or a statement of current international law. This statement, we said, expresses aspirations of the United States within the structure of the US Constitution. Just a few years ago, in 2015, the Obama administration signed a political agreement with Iran to monitor their nuclear production. They were very clear this was not a treaty, it wasn't ratified by Congress. This was a political agreement, meaning this administration was agreeing to it. They had no way to enforce it on other administrations. And it was met with a lot of opposition, both from Israel as well as from the Republican Party. But it was made by the Democratic Party, and President Obama kept it, and then when President Trump came into office, he broke it in 2015. And then in 2018, I think he broke it, sorry. And then when Joe Biden was running for president, he promised that he was going to enter back into this treaty, or into this agreement. And he's been negotiating with Iran for the past several years. And it's been fascinating to watch him negotiate, because he negotiates like the United States has the moral high ground here. Now, first of all, please remember, we are the only nation in the world that's ever used nuclear weapons on civilians. So already we have no moral standing in this whatsoever. We have no integrity. But second, we pull out of the treaty, right? We left the agreement. And yet he's negotiating, saying, you have to live up to all the obligations of the agreement before we go back into it with you. And I was like, you left. What are you talking about? But this is how the United States treats treaties, right? When we break treaties with native nations, what does it mean? Well, you lost your reservation. Well, don't forget, United States, when we made this agreement, not only did this agreement say we got this reservation, it said we were vacating these lands and you were giving us this land and we were giving you that land. So technically, if you break the treaty, yes, we lose our reservation, but you use your rights to the land over here. But that's not how the US sees those things. So we negotiate with Iran, just like we negotiate with native peoples, because we're all people of color. And we're just like, yeah, you have to keep the treaty obligations, even if we pull out. That's our expectation of you. Now, I tell you these things to help you understand how our nation views treaties. And our nation and our book will change these paradigms for you too, truly does see itself as God's chosen people, truly does see itself as a Christian nation, and truly does believe that it has promised land. This is what Manifest Destiny is all about. This is actually why we celebrate Abraham Lincoln. In the Old Testament, there's a story about the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites lived in Canaan, and they were part of the group of people who were going to be ethnically cleansed by the Jewish people as they took control of their promised land. The Canaanites were watching all of their neighbors fall, and they were very afraid, but they were also very shrewd. And so they sent an envoy to Joshua, but they disguised them by putting them in tattered clothes and putting them on camels that were old and weak. And they acted like they had traveled a long distance across the wilderness to come to Joshua. And they said, "We heard tales of what you were doing, and we're afraid for you. We are so in awe of your power. Please sign a treaty with us and spare our lives." Joshua was a bit flattered, even though he was told to leave no one, but he was pretty sure that these people were from far away, so he signed a treaty with them. And just a few verses later, he learned that actually they weren't from far away, they were just around the corner. In fact, they were one of the next nations in line to be ethnically cleansed by the Jewish people. And Joshua decided to honor the treaty against the will of even his own people. In 2 Samuel, when David is king, years later, his kingdom comes under a 3-year famine. And David goes before the Lord and says, "Why are we getting famine? What did we do wrong?" And God says to him, "Your predecessor, King Saul, in his zealousness for Israel, broke the treaty with the Gibeonites and attacked them. And I'm going to hold you accountable until you make amends." So Israel, which in the Old Testament did have a land covenant with God of Abraham, according to the scriptures, but they also had a high value for treaties. And they kept their treaties even when it worked against them. And even when they didn't keep their treaties, their God forced them to keep their treaties. Because their entire relationship was about covenant. For a nation that claims to have a land covenant with the God of Abraham, we have an incredibly low value for covenant. In fact, I would argue we are the exact opposite of a Christian or even a religious nation, because we bend over backwards to make it absolutely clear that we are accountable to nobody. We have veto rights in the UN. We have a worldview that says we can break treaties with anybody without there being any consequence. We say that even though our Constitution, which is the document that governs our nation, even though that states treaties are the supreme law of the land, our Supreme Court rules that whenever it wants, all Congress has to do to break a treaty is to speak the word. We are not a Christian nation. We are the epitome, the definition of a godless nation. A narcissistic, arrogant, ethnic cleansing, genocidal, godless nation who absolutely believes it is accountable to nobody. We have to wrestle with that. The solution is not to become a Christian nation. The solution, and this is one of the other paradigms we shift more implicitly than explicitly in the book, is to acknowledge that white people are not superior. right? We're very comfortable saying Black Lives Matter. We're getting more comfortable saying Black Lives Matter, or Native Lives Matter. But we never speak the actual lie behind those statements. The lie that's written into our Constitution. Yes, it dehumanizes marginalized people, dehumanizes people of color and natives. But the lie of the Constitution is that white people are superior. And we live that way as a country. This is why we're such horrible members of the global community. Because not only do we believe that we're accountable to no one, but we truly believe that our white Americans are the epitome of supremacy. Possessing the right to commit genocide, possessing the right to enact enslavement, possessing the right to hoard the majority of the resources of the world. And we are accountable to nobody. And these are the things I want us to wrestle with as a nation. Two of the things that I believe so deeply. It's a quote, one of them is a quote used by George Erasmus, who was a native leader out of Canada. And during the Truth and Reconciliation up there, he was writing about the reconciliation process. And he used this quote that says, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community, he says, you have to start by creating common memory. I love that quote. I think it gets to the heart of what we struggle with as a nation, which is we don't have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers this mythological legacy of stolen lands and broken treaties, this mythological legacy of discovery and exceptionalism. And we have communities of color that have this lived experience of stolen lands and broken treaties, of slavery and Jim Crow laws, of internment camps and segregation and mass incarceration, families being ripped apart at our borders. And there's no common memory. And if you look back over our history, there is no point in US history where you can point to and say, we had healthy community across racial lines. You can't. There's no point in US history where you can say we got it right that year in regards to race or even gender. We must create this common memory. This book is a book, it's a public rebuke of the church, but it's not about shaming the church. It's not about shaming white people. It's about creating common memory so that we can actually begin to move forward to build a healthier community. I want to thank you for joining me for this book talk today. At the back table, we have copies of Unsettling Truths that are available for purchase. Some of them are signed. I'll go back there and sign some more after we're done. But I wanted to take a few moments here to do some Q&A. Any questions about, I know I've given you a lot in the past hour. Any questions? Yes. The fact that what the visual as a common also has Doctrine of Discovery show up. It takes the whole notion of Sabbath that say sort of the sentiment these are alien beings. Yeah. These are alien beings who cannot be governed under Western values. Yeah. The Constitution doesn't extend to non-incorporated territory. Legal justification for why or U.S. citizens, but not participate in aspect Are you from Puerto Rico, sir?
Yeah.
What? Yeah, you're absolutely correct. There was just during the pandemic, I think it was a Supreme Court case where Puerto Ricans were asking for the same benefits and the same things that the Congress was appropriating for citizens, for main people living in the mainland, and the people in Puerto Rico wanted the same things, and the Supreme Court ruled that they were not compelled, they were not forced to give those same things. There was a fascinating article in the LA Times about that. Apparently, it's only been in the past 2 censuses that they even asked the race question in the Puerto Rican census. And the first time they asked it, which was over 10 years ago now, a large majority of Puerto Ricans marked themselves as white, because that's how they saw themselves. And in this last sentence, there was a huge drop in the number of people who identified as being white. And a lot of it was because of exactly what you were saying. In the LA Times, the way they worded it is they said, Puerto Ricans learned that their definition of being white American and the congressional definition of being white American were absolutely in conflict with each other. They were not white by US standards. And that was, I thought, a very insightful comment, but directly to your point, which is I've actually mentioned that what you were talking about in other lectures I've given about how, yeah, we truly, I live in Washington, DC, right? We don't have a vote, right? We are one of the colonies of this. I moved from the Navajo Nation in Arizona to another underrepresented place, which is Washington, DC, where we don't even have a voice in our government. And so, yeah, it's fascinating how there's a book I highly recommend. It's a hard read. I'm reading it just now myself. It's called How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Marwar. This book is gut-wrenching. It talks about all of the ways that the United States hides its imperial values and the way that we've built one of the most invisible yet destructive empires in the history of the world. Highly recommend this book, How to Hide an Empire. You can get it both on Audible or as a paper copy. I have both. I bought this months ago, and I wasn't getting through it near as fast as I wanted to, so I bought the Audible book so I can read it. I listen to it when I'm driving. But thank you for bringing that comment up. I really appreciate that. Yes.
I have a question. It's related to your example where you said you went to a community where the houses were abandoned and people were renters and they wished they could own. And I mean, I agree with you said that Doctrine of Discovery has been a terrible thing to usurping land from Native Americans. But what do you tell people who are landless, who organize themselves into a movement to try to get land? And sometimes they say things like in Brazil, the land was moved. We found some land that wasn't being used. It's government land, it's fallow, nobody's growing crops there. So we're going to go in there and occupy it. Is that okay? Or does that have its own problems? Is that another use of the Doctrine of Discovery? Or is it different if landless and marginalized persons are trying to get land for themselves because they've already been dispossessed?
Here's another really good book. It's called The Land Is Not Empty. It's written by a good friend of mine, Sarah Augustine. I actually wrote the foreword for this book. I highly recommend it because she addresses that issue very directly with how today it's not only governments using the Doctrine of Discovery as corporations. And it's how there is this view of the land is empty. And so they're just running over the rights of the indigenous people that maybe have already been ethnically cleansed from that land and not acknowledging their rights to that land in the first place. But it's this worldview of there's this if land is not being exploited and profited from, we're not using it enough. And that's one of the paradigms of the Doctrine of Discovery that's been so ingrained or embedded into our psyche as Americans, is we have to find a way to profit from this land. This is why, right, the Lakota people saying the Black Hills aren't for sale. The US doesn't know what to do with that because everything's for sale, it believes. Right? This is why there's very few talks about reparation of Native peoples. A, how do you pay reparations for an entire continent? And B, what if the people you're negotiating with don't see their land as a financial asset? And so there's a lot of challenges in there, but you're raising up a very good question. I think the thing that I'm trying to change here, and I'm not acknowledging the injustice that's working under the system. And if you want to go back even further, let's go back to the African American community when they were, I don't want to say when slavery was abolished, because we haven't abolished slavery if you read the 13th Amendment. When chattel slavery was ended, they were promised 40 acres and a mule. Now, the problem with that promise, A, it was never kept. I don't think our government ever intended to keep it. But B, they promised something that wasn't theirs to give. The meal they could probably get by with, but the 40 acres wasn't theirs to give. They stole that land. And so what they were doing, I would surmise, what they were doing was, rather than trying to say what they were going to do for African American people, they were trying to align the aspirations of African Americans with those of white Americans. And so now African Americans would be on the side of the oppressor, looking to benefit from the oppression of the next group of people, which is Native Americans. And so one of the things that I talk about frequently in my talks is that the goal is not just to acquire what the white man has. This is why I don't use the term white privilege. White privilege makes it sound like what white people have is a blessing they have to learn how to share. The reason white people have more than others is not a blessing that they were given, it's a racial injustice that they took. And to aspire to that is to aspire to oppression. So this is why we have to change the paradigm. This is why we have to have a new set of rules. This is why we have to deal with land titles. Because the way the system is set up right now, capital and profit in our nation is dependent upon the ongoing oppression of another group of people. So you're bringing up a very good question. There's no simple answer to these things. But this is where we have to wrestle with them at some very deep levels, because yeah, there is injustice, but if we're really going to try to act justly, we have to not just deal with the current situation, we have to deal with the historic injustice that we've never had a reckoning for. Thanks for bringing that up. Yes, in the back row. Yeah, and this, again, this is the problem, because what we're addressing is we're addressing the injustice within the current colonial system, but we're not changing the values of the colonial system. And so this is what makes, I was having this conversation, I've had this conversation with other kind of social justice activists and leaders, and this is where they all get stumped. Right, is because it's easier to advocate, and let's just get everybody in houses, right? That's not easily attainable, but it's a solution that you might be able to grasp. But when you acknowledge that land titles are dehumanizing, and just giving more people access to them only increases that oppression. That's where, so you know, I ran for president in 2020, right? And so people will say Social Security is the third rail of US politics. Well, Social Security is the third rail, land titles in the Doctrine of Discovery is the nuclear power plant that's powering the third rail, right? So no one wants to have the conversation about what do we do about this, because it's so overwhelming and it requires so much change that people don't even know how to begin to think about tackling it. But this is where I'm saying, as a Native man, No, if we can't have this conversation, we're never going to solve the problems we're facing. Because they're always going to be dependent upon the oppression of Native peoples. And so I don't acknowledge these problems are overwhelming. I don't deny these problems are overwhelming. They absolutely are. But this is the challenge we face due to the fact that we've never lost a war that matters. And we've never had a corrective moment in our 250 years. Not corrected by us ourselves, corrected by someone outside with a more objective voice and direction for the corrective action. I appreciate you bringing that up. Yes. Yeah. Two stories. For people who didn't hear them, why does it seem that Native peoples have such a different understanding of the love for this land than what white people may have? And what helps us, inspires us to take on these massive challenges, if I'm hearing your questions correctly? Several years ago, when President Obama went to Alaska to rename Mount McKinley back to Mount Denali, it was named Mount Denali after a mountain climber came out of exploring the mountains, and he heard that McKinley had been nominated for president within his party. And he was so happy, he decided to name the mountains he was in Mount McKinley. And the name stuck, even though McKinley had never been there. And that even though that mountain was the sacred mountain of the Athabascan people, Mount Denali, part of their creation story. And ever since then, the Athabascan people have been trying to rename the mountain back to Denali instead of McKinley. And it happened in 2016, I think, or 2015, when President Obama finally went back and renamed it. And at the time, Sojourners contacted me, and they asked me to write a story, an article, an op-ed for their magazine about why that renaming was significant for Native peoples. The article I gave them, I wrote the article, but the article I gave them was why that renaming was significant for white people, right? One of the things that white Americans don't have, and they can't steal it, they can't colonize it, they can't take it, is legitimacy in this land. Every person is indigenous to somewhere. White people have largely lost their indigenous understandings of the world. Through all their wars in Europe, through all their movements, through everything, they've lost their sense of indigenity, they've lost their creation stories. And so they've co-opted the creation story from the Bible. And they treat those stories like science textbooks instead of like creation stories. And now they claim that this land is their promised land, but they don't have any stories about this land. And so they're trying to build monuments to themselves. So this is why they steal the Black Hills and carve faces of the presidents into them. This is why they name mountains like McKinley. They rename mountains like Denali to McKinley. They're trying to somehow etch their existence into this land that they stole. But it's not working. I actually often refer to white people as a group of people that desperately needs to be adopted, right? They came here largely seeking financial prosperity. And they have no stories here, they have no rights here, they have no legitimacy here. And so they're like children who are desperately need to be adopted and have legitimately shared with them. And so I pointed out how Denali got named to McKinley. And I pointed out how ever since then, the Athabascan people have been trying to get their mountain name back to Denali. Long before Obama had the idea. And I said, that is incredibly generous. Denali is part of their creation story. They wanted this country of their colonizers to use that name. How generous is that, right? They could have said, screw these people. They're ignorant, they don't know anything. Who cares what they call it? We know this is Denali, and we're going to keep this sacred for ourselves. But they said, no, we want to share this name. We want our colonizers to use this name. We want them to understand this story. What amazing generosity that the Athabascan people would be willing to share the sacred name of this mountain with the people who colonized them. It's an entirely different perspective. When I was pastoring a church in Denver, this is the early 2000s. And I was wrestling with what does it mean to be Native American and be a Christian? And I was looking at the issue of contextualizing worship. My church was helping me to go down this path. I got involved with a group called the World Christian Gathering on Indigenous Peoples and was sharing stories and walking life with Indigenous Christians from all over the world who were in the process of decolonizing their faith. And after being in that movement, even just for a year, I realized I had to be back on my reservation. I really wanted to be a part of this movement, really wanted to, because I'm the son of boarding school. My father is the child of boarding school survivors. So they didn't teach the language to my father, so he didn't know how to teach it to me. I grew up in a border town off the reservation. I never spoke my language. And I realized if I really want to be a part of the leader in this movement, I have to move back to my reservation and understand my culture. And so we moved back to one of the most rural places we could find on the Navajo Nation. We moved back to a place, we were 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road. We were living in a one-room hogan with no running water, no electricity. The community we lived in was completely off the grid. We had to use an outhouse, we had to haul our water, we had to live by candlelight. And we prepared to live off the grid, right? We psyched ourselves up to live off the grid. We moved there intentionally. We didn't raise support. We didn't go under the guise of any agency. We just went there to live. But the hardest thing about living there was not living off the grid. The moment we moved there, we felt like we had dropped off the face of the earth. I could not believe how absolutely marginalized reservation life was. Literally felt like we dropped off the face of the earth. I could count on one hand the number of non-native peoples who visited our hogan in that first 2 years we lived there. Now, on one hand, the people who came to visit us on the reservation. At the same time, I'm feeling this marginalization. I'm witnessing the historical trauma of my people, resulting in the broken families, the gangs, the drug addiction, the abuse. I'm feeling the pain of my community. And I'm trying to make sense of this. I'm actually feeling my own insecurities about who I was and what it meant to be there. And I'm wrestling through this with some of my friends, most of which at that point were not native, but I lived off the reservation for so long. And so I was calling them and emailing them, trying to make sense of what I was going through. And every time we started talking about life on the reservation, and I was learning more about the history, and I could feel the anger coming up in me. And soon I either had to hang up the phone or drop out of the conversation so I wouldn't yell at my friends. So I taught myself how to disassociate from the conversation. So I would talk about it in the third person, like I read in the newspaper, so I could stay engaged longer. That allowed me to stay in the conversation longer, but soon my friends would be dropping out as they were faced with shame and guilt and other things, and they didn't know what to say, so they would drop out of the conversation. And I didn't know how to have a dialogue adequately articulating what I was feeling and yet still keeping my relationships in the conversation. And one day I was writing a letter to my friends. It was like the 10th time I was trying to articulate what I was going through and how it felt to live on a native reservation in the middle of our country. And I said in this letter, I said, it feels like our native communities are this old grandmother who has a very large and a very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they violently locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party inside our house. Now, they've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to our bedroom, but it's much later. We're tired, we're old, we're weak, we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts us the most, the thing that causes us the most pain is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house. I wrote that and I'm like, that's it. That's what I'm feeling. I shared that with some of my non-native, I shared it first with my native friends. And they're like, one friend said to me, I've lived here all my life, Mark. I've always struggled to articulate how it felt, and you're hitting the nail on the head. I shared that with other non-native peoples. And instead of getting angry, getting ashamed, they would come back and say, how do we say thank you? How does my family, my city, my church, my nation express gratitude to the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island? See, now we're having a very different conversation. Instead of talking about victim versus oppressor, we're talking about what I think is the heart of the problem, which is we have a huge reversal of roles. We have a nation that likes to call itself a nation of immigrants, which lets them ignore the fact that there's two demographics who never immigrated here: Native Americans who are indigenous and African Americans who were brought here and enslaved. And these people, these immigrants, like to pretend that they own the land. Meanwhile, you have indigenous peoples who've been pushed aside to society, to the margins, and we're treated like unwanted guests in someone else's house. And if we're going to ever fix the problem of living here together, we have to reverse these roles. I need, in some very real and practical ways, for these undocumented immigrants to understand that they are guests in someone else's house. And I want my native people to understand, in some very real and practical ways, we are the host people of the land. And we need to conduct ourselves as the host. So these are the paradigms I'm trying to shift to do and explain exactly what I think you are asking. And I think if we can find a way to do that, we'll be on a much better path to living here better together. Thank you for asking that. Yes, sir. It's a start, but it's not fixing the problem. And especially if it just becomes more of a formula, then it's not helpful. If it's actually coming from a place of understanding the history and the people who were living on the land before you, that can be helpful. If it just becomes a formula, a box you're checking to do, then that's not very helpful. So I thank you for that question. I appreciate that. I want to honor people's time. I know I could probably go on like this for hours, and but I'm sure you all have things to do, but I really appreciate all of you coming out. I'm so grateful that we can have this talk. If you would like to purchase a book, we have signed copies of the book in the back for $20 each. Even if you don't purchase a copy of the book, there are bookmarks there. On the back of the bookmark is a QR code that gives a link to my Patreon site, where I give weekly and make regular posts to that about the work I'm doing and the lectures I'm giving and the things I'm trying to bring into the discussion. There also is an ongoing monthly book study going through Unsettling Truths with me and my co-author. Once a month, we do a live stream with him and I going through a chapter of Unsettling Truths. We just in July did chapter 6. So if you subscribe today, not only do you get this month's chapter, but you get all the archive chapters as well. And if you stay subscribed, you'll get each new month that comes out. And if you like what I'm trying to do, this book tour is not being funded by a PR firm or even my publisher. I just really wanted to get out and engage the nation with this book some more and to try and get it into more people's hands. And so one of the best ways to support this book tour is to buy a book, but also if you'd like to help me cover the expenses, on the bookmark is my website, which is Wireless Hogan. And on my website, there is a link to the Unsettling Truths on my website. And on there is a link to my GoFundMe page, where if you want to make a donation to help fund this book tour, you can get the GoFundMe page off of my website. So, but I'm happy to stick around and answer more questions. And if you have a book that you already bought that you'd like me to sign, I'm more than happy to sign that too. So after we're done here, I'll go ahead and move back to the book table, and I'm happy to talk to anyone and answer more questions back there. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to St. Peter's Episcopal Church for opening up the space here. I am deeply grateful to you for doing that.
Thanks for joining us. I'm gonna end the recording now. Maybe, if I can figure out how.